Today, I would like to discuss what is the concept of personal diversity. Now, whenever we talk of diversity, we think of a classroom diversity or employment diversity. And that simply means that in a university or in another educational institution, there should be gender diversity, there should be racial diversity, there should be ethnic diversity, and maybe there should be international diversity. That students from all over the world are recruited to study in the same institution. Now, not every university and not every institution can afford to enforce maximum diversity because international students, for example, may only go to top universities and they may not go to every nation. So, institutional diversity or educational diversity can occur only if there are diverse people available who are willing to study at a given institution. But if an institution is closed to diversity, that simply means that it will educate only a certain group of people, maybe all boys, all girls, maybe in the United States, a school might be predominantly white, or a school may be predominantly black, or Hispanic, or Asian. So, in that sense, institutional diversity means that people from all backgrounds are studying simultaneously in the same institution. But that's not what I want to talk about. I do not want to talk about diversity in institutions, diversity in employment situation, or diversity in other contexts. I want to talk about personal diversity. And I don't mean to suggest that diversity at the workplace or diversity in education institutions is not important. It's very, very important. And it is good for everyone that they study with people who come from different backgrounds. Diversity enriches the educational experience of everyone, including students and teachers as well. I think if teacher is teaching a very diverse class, his or her teaching will be very different than if he or she is teaching people of his or her own kind. So diversity is useful for everyone involved in a given situation. But personal diversity, that is the focus of today, that is the diversity within an individual. And you might say, well, how can you have diversity within the same individual? And what I call personal diversity. And I would like to explain that. First, I do want to say that personal diversity is completely possible. And as a human being, an individual must try to acquire personal diversity. It is easier for parents to expose their children to diversity, to personal diversity, and it will be difficult for a mature adult, but not impossible, but difficult for a mature person to acquire personal diversity. So let me explain first what personal diversity is. Take the very simple example of language. How many languages do you speak? If you speak only one language, and if you understand only one language, then of course there is no linguistic diversity within your being, because you have only one language in which you comprehend reality. And therefore, you are limited in terms of acquiring reality and in terms of expressing reality in the only one language that you know. Now, even within the same language, there could be some diversity. For example, take English. Now, English of the United States is somewhat different than the English spoken in Canada, than the English spoken in Great Britain, and definitely it is different from the English spoken in India or Pakistan or Nigeria. So even though you are speaking English and that's the only language that you understand, and that's the only language that you speak, but if you come in touch with people who speak English but they have different cultural background, and you have been with such people, then you could say that even though you speak one language, still because of your exposure to Anglophones from different countries and different cultures, you have acquired diversity within the language, within the English language. Your diversity is minimal, or your linguistic diversity is minimal, when you speak only one language and only one language spoken in a given country. For example, let's say that you're an American and you are raised in the Midwest, and you are not exposed to English of another country, or English even of the East Coast or West Coast or the South. And definitely you have not spent time with Anglophones from Great Britain or Ireland or India or some other countries where English is spoken, then your linguistic depth or your linguistic universe is confined to the Midwest. And your diversity within the language is much more limited as compared to a person who also speaks only one language, English, but that person has been exposed to different dialects of English, different versions of English spoken in other countries. Now, if you have been exposed to English spoken in other countries, then you've begun to realize that even though people speak English, but they speak in different accents, like the British accent is very different than the Indian accent, and the American accent is different than the Nigerian accent. So accent is not critical to speaking good English. A British, of course, that's the language they invented, speak English in a very distinct accent. And that doesn't mean that only the British accent is the most natural accent to speak good English. Even, someone who speaks with an Indian accent, but that person is highly educated in the language of English, you will find that that person could speak very beautiful and effective English, even though the Indian accent is much different than the British accent. Now, personal diversity in the case of language is even broader if you speak 2 or 3 languages. For example, let's say a person speaks English and French and let's say that person also speaks German. Now, even though all these three languages are related to the Western civilization, and even though these are three distinct languages, nevertheless, there is something common to these three languages, and that is the Western civilization, the Western culture, which has affected almost every language spoken in the Western civilization. But compare this person who speaks English, French, and German with a person who only speaks English. Definitely, you would conclude that the linguistic diversity of a person who speaks three languages is much broader and deeper than the person who speaks only one language. Even though all these three languages are related in the form of culture and civilization. Now let's introduce another person who speaks English and speaks Arabic or Hebrew. Now, this person speaks two languages, and two distinct languages, and two languages that are related to two different cultures and civilizations. English is related to the Western civilization, is related to the Western culture, whereas Arabic is related to the Middle Eastern culture. It is related to Middle Eastern civilization. Arabic is also related to the religion of Islam, even though English is also becoming a language of Islam. So you will find that a person who speaks Arabic and English will have two very different languages to process the same reality. And the personal diversity of this particular person is much deeper than a person who speaks two languages related to the same culture and civilization. So, personal diversity in the form of language, just as one example, is much deeper and broader when the person speaks two or more languages derived from or representing vastly different cultures and civilizations. Now, you could also say that some languages are more rich than other languages, and that culture and the level of development and the scientific research that has been done in that culture is going to deepen the conceptual and the intellectual dimensions of that language. Very true. I think there is no doubt that some languages spoken in the West, for example, English, again, or the French, they are languages of highly successful and modern and scientific cultures. And therefore, some of the depth that comes with development and culture is also going to be present in the language which is spoken in that culture. But the question remains that whether a person who just speaks one language is more diverse than a person who speaks two or three languages, even though all two or three languages are not equally developed in terms of its intellectual and experiential content. I think my view is that a person who speaks two or more languages has a better a possibility of understanding reality from many different perspectives than a person who speaks only one language. Now, similarly, personal diversity could be in terms of your racial composition. Let's say that you are of one race. Let's say that your father is African and your mother is African, and your grandparents were Africans, and your great grandparents were Africans. Now, here, obviously, your racial diversity is limited because you represent one race, and that is the African race. And even though Africa is very diverse, for example, if you're in Egypt, which is in Africa, then your racial composition could be very different than if you are in Chad or Cameroon. So I understand that African race is much more complex than we tend to understand it. But the point is that unless you represent many different races in your personal being, your racial diversity is going to be determined according to the racial composition of your being. For example, if your one parent came from a European stock and your other parent came from an Asian stock, then obviously you have more racial diversity as compared to a person whose both parents came from the European stock. So the point is that a person is diverse racially when that person is exposed to, in his personal being, to more than one race. Now, distinguish between experiential racial diversity from some hypothetical racial diversity. Let's say that 100 or 200 years ago, one of your grandparents came from a different racial stock, but everybody else was from one and the same racial stock. Let's say that you have one African ancestor in your long history of ancestry. Now, over the decades and centuries, that racial diversity is going to be compromised. And as far as you're concerned, you do not have any direct racial and racial experience because your immediate parents and families, they're all of the European stock, and only a remote ancestor was of African ancestry. When I say personal diversity in the racial sense, I mean that you have first-hand experience of understanding or representing or being of more than one race. For example, if your father is African and your mother is white, obviously you're going to be racially diverse. And that racial diversity is not abstract. It is instant and it is immediate. And it is part of your consciousness. It is part of your being. It is not abstract. You know it. You have relatives who are white and you have relatives who are black. And therefore, your sense of racial diversity is very real. Just like someone who speaks two languages, his or her diversity is very real. It is not some abstract diversity. He can articulate an idea into different languages. He can understand people speaking two different languages. And similarly, a person whose parents are from different racial groups, that person understands, if that person has been exposed to both races, what it means to be black and what it means to be white. Again, it depends that to what extent this person whose parents are black and white, to what extent this person has been exposed to the racial sensitivities of their parents. Now, in addition to racial and linguistic diversity, there are many other forms of diversities that can occupy a human being or an individual. For example, if you have lived in different cultures, let's say that you speak two languages, and let's say that your parents are of different racial stocks, but you as an individual have always lived in one town or in one country. Now, even though you're linguistically diverse, and even though you're racially diverse in your personality, your cultural diversity might be limited because you have not been exposed to different cultures. You have not been exposed to living in different countries. But let us say that you have lived part of your life in Pakistan, as I have, and part of your life in the United States, as I do now. Now, my experience of these two different cultures is very real. Even though I have lived more now in the United States than I lived in Pakistan, but nevertheless, I spent almost 27, 28 years of my life, the formative period of my life in Pakistan. And therefore, I am exposed to Pakistani culture. And I understand Pakistani culture, even though it has changed in the last 30-some years as I came to the United States. And my periodic visits to Pakistan revives my understanding of the Pakistani culture. So, in that sense, any person who has lived in more than one cultures for a significant amount of time, we will say that that person has acquired cultural diversity in his or her personality. You can go further and say that you can also acquire educational diversity. For example, let's say that you spend most of your life practicing law, and that's all you do. And even though your undergrad was in different subjects, but ever since you joined the law school and ever since you graduated from the law school, you have been spending most of your time studying and practicing or teaching law. In that sense, your educational diversity has now become limited. But if you are interested in psychology or in history, or if you're interested in sociology, and you spend a substantial amount of your time studying subjects other than law, then you would say, or somebody would say, that your educational diversity is much broader and deeper as compared to a person who simply devotes his or her time studying law. Now, there is this pressure on professionals like lawyers and accountants and physicians that they spend most of their time in the field of their expertise, and that any dilution by devoting your intellectual resources to acquiring other forms of knowledge or other disciplines will somehow minimize your expertise in your own profession. I disagree with that. I strongly disagree with that. I think in order to be a good professional in any field, whether it is law, whether it is medicine, whether it is accounting, any field, you will be a much better expert if you have educational diversity and if you devote some of your time in studying other disciplines. For example, the study of psychology or the study of economics could be very beneficial to a practicing attorney. Similarly, a law professor, for example, is going to be much more effective if, in addition to law, that professor has acquired significant educational experience in another field. For example, law and economics, law and sociology, law and history. These law and other disciplines, I think they are very useful in order to build your personal diversity. Now, unfortunately, the concept of personal diversity is not emphasized. And maybe the concept of personal diversity is actually undermined, or it is not looked upon favorably. And that is a big mistake. I think we should encourage individuals from their childhood. And that's why I'm saying that parents have some responsibility to raise their children so that the children acquire personal diversity. Teach your children another language. Take your children to another country. Expose your children to other races. I think it's even better if your spouse is from a racially different stock. In fact, I remember in teaching human rights, I used to say that in a racist country such as the United States or South Africa, it is a moral obligation on individuals to marry across the racial borders. I don't know how students took that advice of mine, and I never heard any feedback on this piece of advice. But that's what I believe, that in a racially uptight culture, such as the United States, speeches on racial diversity are going to be less effective than actually producing children across races. Similarly, in a religiously intolerant society, it will be incumbent upon and maybe morally obligating upon individuals to marry people from other religions. And I think any barriers to interreligious marriages should be viewed with great amount of skepticism. And that is one way to build religious tolerance. If your wife is, or if your husband is from a different religion, then your children are going to be exposed to different religions. And their sense of religious pluralism is not going to be abstract. It's going to be real. It is going to be part of their experience. So I think I have made the point that personal diversity is accumulating experiential and intellectual infrastructure or equipment whereby racial diversity and linguistic diversity and cultural diversity and educational diversity, all these different, and others have not exhausted this topic, but these were just examples to make my point, that all forms of diversity should be accumulated in your own person. And once you have become personally diverse, I think you would live a very fulfilling, humane, and perhaps loving life. And you will be a source of mercy and kindness. And people will feel very comfortable. People from very different backgrounds will feel very comfortable with you, because after accumulating all this diversity, it is very unlikely that you will be bigoted in any sense of the word. Even though I think human beings are surprising, and you can find someone who, despite all this personal diversity, is still intolerant. But I think those individuals would be very few. Individuals who are not exposed to any form of diversity are much more likely to be close-minded and much more likely to be bigoted. Even though I have seen people who are not personally diverse, very tolerant and very open to diversity, even though they are not personally diverse. So I think I would close my comment by saying that I personally believe that personal diversity is a goal that human civilization should construct for every individual